The war that remade the world order isn't the one you think. World War I established our notion of global governance, passports, altered the money we use, and even gave us fascism. And yet, before researching this video, this student of American public schooling could remember just two things about the Great War: espionage and Franz Ferdinand. And that's largely thanks to the early 2000s rock band. So I decided to dig deeper, and here are 12 fascinating legacies of World War I that we still live with today. Legacy 1. Passports. Did you know passports as we know them were not a thing before World War I? Now, they were not a totally new concept. The term arose in England in the 16th century when the power to issue travel documents became a power of the king's advisors. But in the decades leading up to World War I, travelers entered and left countries without passports. The world before 1914 generally saw free movement of people. By the way, if you'd like to learn more about how immigration creates a more prosperous world, check out the Learn Liberty blog. The post with that title is linked below. Anyway, that generally free movement of people came to a crashing halt during World War I when European governments sought to limit the emigration of citizens with useful skills. Then, after the war, the little booklets we know today were put forward by the League of Nations. In 1920, the League of Nations held the Paris Conference on Passports, Customs Formalities, and Through Tickets to define passport guidelines and booklet design. A year later, seizing a political opportunity, the U.S. passed the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. Then came the Immigration Act of 1924, limiting the inflow of immigrants. So it's no exaggeration to say that the modern system of passports and borders, which gives freaking birds more migration rights than humans, is a consequence of World War I era restrictions. What can we learn? I answer that question with a question. Can you see governments ever peeling back the requirement for these passports? And what does that say about so-called temporary or emergency powers and restrictions? Legacy 2. Global governance. Remember we mentioned the League of Nations? Yeah, the whole notion of a global governance structure is our second legacy of World War I. Back in the day, the League was an international peacekeeping organization headquartered in Geneva. It was created after the First World War to provide a forum for countries to resolve their disputes. It was first proposed by President Woodrow Wilson as part of his 14 points plan for peace in Europe. But he couldn't get the Senate to agree, so the US never became a member. And many historians believe the League was much less effective without the US than it could have been. More on Wilson and the US's entry into the war linked below. The premise of the League of Nations was that security threats to one member demanded responses from all members, but when the rubber met the road, the organization was toothless. For example, unlike the US, Britain and France did join the League. In fact, they were the two most influential members. Then they ignored the League in their efforts to appease Hitler. As he consolidated power, the League of Nations was leaking oil. Japan gave notice of its withdrawal in 1933, Italy in 1937, and finally on the 20th of April 1946, the League of Nations handed over all its assets, library, and archives to the newly created United Nations. Some critics say the League of Nations' biggest weakness was that it prohibited war and yet allowed for exceptions under certain conditions. Again, we ask, what can we learn? And again, I answer that question with a question. Do you think there should be global governance? And theoretically, how big could the concept of governance grow? My takeaway from the failure of the League of Nations and the toothlessness of the modern UN, if government exists at all, it needs to be as small and as local as possible. Legacy 3. Nazi Germany and World War II. We touched on how the British and French contributed to the downfall of the League of Nations. Of course, World War I and its aftermath also led directly to an uprise of Nazism. It goes back to the Treaty of Versailles, which forced Germany to accept the blame for World War I. Germany had to give up its overseas colonies, surrender 13% of its European territory, give to France full and absolute possession of the coal mines in the Saar Basin, stop maintaining or constructing fortifications on the left bank of the Rhine, and pay reparations to the winners of the war. The last payment, by the way, was made as recently as 2010. As one scholar said, the Treaty of Versailles was a dictum enacted by victors from vanquished under the influence of the blindness, ignorance, hatred, and propagandist misconceptions to which war had given rise. This vindictive punishment fomented anger and provided the socio-political backdrop for populism in Germany. In particular, it gave one populist a plausible claim that the rest of the world was out to get Germany, that Germany had better rally together, behind him, of course. By the way, if you're interested in how populists rise to power and what makes them tick, see our sister channel, the Invisible Lenses video on how evil Morty from the series Rick and Morty methodically takes over the Citadel of Ricks. Anyway, here are that real-world populist's exact words in 1923, right around the time of the beer hall push. The Treaty of Versailles was designed to, quote, bring 20 million Germans to their deaths and ruin the German nation. Adolf Hitler. Indeed, one of his Nazi Party's central campaign promises was to undo the treaty, and the German delegation had said the Treaty of Versailles was a disrespect of the right of self-determination. Meanwhile, a related result of World War I was America's rededication to isolationism. President Warren Harding said in his inaugural address in 1921 that the U.S. needed a return to normalcy. So when Hitler was spreading fascism and carving up the map of Europe like a risk board, the response from the U.S. Congress was to pass the Neutrality Acts. What's the takeaway? Say it with me. We can answer that question with a question. What happens when you kick someone when he's down? You might make him bitter, resentful, vengeful. Obviously, Germany and Hitler are to blame for the Second World War. But that doesn't mean we should let the other global superpowers off the hook for their heavy-handedness after the first one. So far, we've mainly focused on the legacies of World War I in the realm of international relations. But now we're going to shift to the economic ramifications of the Great War, starting with one that falls into both categories. Legacy 4, a new superpower. Speaking of global superpowers, when World War I started, the US was well on its way to becoming one. Its national economic output had already surpassed the UK's and was more than twice Germany's. US pre-war steel production exceeded France, Germany, and Britain combined. But World War I multiplied that power. For one, it damaged the European power players, even the ones on the winning side, like Great Britain and France. And because those countries couldn't have survived without food shipments from the US, they wound up owing the US about $10 billion. Moreover, the reparations imposed on Germany and loan repayments owed by Britain and France made European economies dependent on financing from the United States. So we can say that World War I made the US the world's leading creditor and the unofficial custodian of the gold standard, which we'll come back to later. As German sociologist Max Weber wrote after World War I, American global dominance was now inevitable. Legacy 5, World War Champions T-shirts. Allow me 10 seconds on my soapbox. The US winning World War I enabled frat bros to wear maybe the most annoying and ignorant T-shirts ever made. Get yours now at Walmart. I'm kidding. Please don't. Legacy 6, the end of the gold standard. As for that gold standard, World War I was the death knell. It was expensive, obviously, and governments needed to raise money for it. One way governments can raise money is to raise taxes, but that might not go over well with voters. Instead, governments resorted to the hidden tax of inflation. They couldn't inflate the quantity of gold, though, and so the major players in World War I abandoned the gold standard entirely. The United States even imposed an embargo on the export of gold bullion in 1917. By decreeing, or fiating, that paper money would take over for gold as legal tender, governments could suddenly print all the money they needed. Doing so transfers the purchasing power away from the people through rising prices. This is why Ludwig von Mises referred to inflationary war financing as anti-democratic. Legacy 7, a strengthened Fed. Not coincidentally, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 had established a central bank to oversee monetary policy, the Fed. World War I was the first major test of its dastardly duty, and it passed with flying colors. Essentially, the Fed helped finance the war by facilitating the sale of war bonds and providing loans to banks that bought treasury certificates. In the long run, it helped the Fed develop the financial resources and expertise necessary to function as a central bank. And after the war, the Fed broke free from the treasury and managed to make the US dollar the major international currency. So we've covered international relations and economics, now some legacies in the realm of war and how governments use it to expand their powers. Legacy 8, Conscription. Mises wrote that it's the pretext for innumerable measures of government interference. He had in mind the idea of total war, which not only includes civilian resources and infrastructure as military targets, but also mobilizes all resources of society to fight the war and gives priority to warfare over any possible civilian needs. So, for example, number 8 on our list, conscription. It's a fundamental denial of freedom, and yet it emerged more fully during World War I. Unlike in France, Germany, and Russia, in Britain, citizenship had never required military obligations. Then Britain's Military Service Act was passed in January 1916. It imposed conscription on all single men ages 18 to 41. Conscription was extended to married men in May 1916, and during the last months of the war, to men up to the age of 51. That set the precedent for an expanded draft, both in Britain and the US, for World War II and beyond. Legacy 9, Murder Technology. More on the idea of total war. We said it includes civilian resources and infrastructure as military targets, but the murder technology that emerged from World War I made those targets all the more vulnerable. The widespread use of poison gas is maybe the Great War's most haunting legacy. Early on, the French used tear gas grenades to halt German offensives, but the first large-scale deployment of lethal weapons was in the Belgian medieval town of Ypres, April 22, 1915. German soldiers attacked with 6,000 canisters of chlorine gas. Eventually, both sides started to set off their own gas attacks. It wafted over battlefields and wounded more than 1 million people, killing 70,000. Many survivors suffered from lung and respiratory problems for the rest of their lives. Some were left permanently blind. After the war, the 1925 Geneva Protocol banned chemical weapons, and remarkably, during World War II, chemical weapons weren't used on a large scale. But the US and the Soviets developed large stockpiles of chemical weapons during the Cold War, and Saddam Hussein's Iraq used mustard and nerve gases, first against Iran, then against Iraq's Kurdish minority in 1988. Other devastating technology came online during World War I as well. In fact, German officer Ernst Jünger called it the Storm of Steel in his memoir. For example, the earliest guided missiles were introduced during World War I. Air-to-air missiles, anti-armor missiles to destroy tanks, cruise missiles fired from ships, and missiles fired from submarines. One of the most powerful missiles of all is the multiple warhead intercontinental missile. All were developed for use during the First World War. So were machine guns, tanks, and motorized transport vehicles. Even something as seemingly innocuous as barbed wire, originally used to herd cattle, saw its first use to restrict the movement of human beings during World War I. Legacy 10, the Espionage Act. The 1910s were a time of massive expansion of government powers. Before the war had even started, President William Howard Taft had signed into law the Defense Secrets Act of 1911. It criminalized the sharing of sensitive information with those who lacked clearance. After the United States entered the war in 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act, building on that 1911 law. The Espionage Act was designed to prevent sabotage, but its powers were deepened by the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it possible to prosecute anyone who criticized or protested the war. That led to some high-profile convictions, most notably that of socialist Eugene Debs, who was sentenced to 10 years in prison in 1918 for promoting resistance to the draft. The acts also outlawed false statements intended to interfere with military operations, and attempts to incite insubordination or obstruct the recruitment of troops, and false statements promoting the success of America's enemies. If the crimes were committed during wartime, the punishment could be as severe as the death penalty. These acts, of course, were clear infringements on the First Amendment, and even though the Sedition Act was technically repealed in December 1920, sections of it have been used over the years. For example, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were charged under the act and executed. More recently, Donald Trump faced questions about whether he violated the act after the FBI seized top-secret documents that he had taken to his Mar-a-Lago residence. Let's end on a slightly more uplifting note, shall we? 2 more legacies of World War I that aren't nearly as dangerous to liberty as those first 10. Legacy 11, women's rights. At the time of the First World War, most women were barred from voting or serving in military combat roles. But with millions of men away from home, women filled manufacturing and agricultural positions, and some even traveled to the front lines to serve as nurses, ambulance drivers, and translators. Moreover, many housewives in the U.S. were asked to sign a pledge card to promise they would carry out the directions and advice of the food administrator in the conduct of my household. This meant canning food for future use, growing vegetables in the backyard, and limiting consumption of meat, wheat, and fats. Most of all, women were expected to bolster the morale of their families at home and loved ones overseas. Whether or not it's right that they were obligated to do those things, and it's not, on the home front, public attitudes toward women's role in America began to change. President Woodrow Wilson had ignored suffrage completely in his 1916 address to Congress, but by 1918 he supported suffrage as a war measure, noting that war could not be fought effectively without women's participation. No coincidence, passed by Congress in 1919, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. Legacy 12, a new map and a new world order. If you've ever looked at a map of modern Europe and Asia and wondered how all those arbitrary lines got there, you have World War I to thank. By the end of the war, the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and German empires that had dominated Europe for centuries no longer existed. They were broken up into new nation-states, including Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. No doubt these new countries were poor, and worse, in conflict with each other. Versailles and several other post-war conferences established borders based primarily on language and ethnicity. And unfortunately, those factors alone aren't enough to guarantee peace. However, World War I actually led to a decline of European imperialism in Africa and Asia, as those continents saw writ large the hypocrisies, limitations, and vulnerabilities of colonialism. Indeed, after World War I, European colonialism began, slowly but surely, to recede. So there you have it, 12 legacies of World War I that we still live with today. Of course, the idea of war in general continues to haunt the human race. Read what 3 of my intellectual heroes, Rand, Rothbard, and Soule, thought about war in the Learn Liberty blog post linked below.